Maybe if you have the patriarchy, but you fill it with women, then it's no longer a tyranny.
Yeah.
Well, that seems to be the idea, although then you don't know if the tyranny is the men or if it's the structure. Well, if the patriarchal structure is the problem, why in the world would you put success in that? Why would you elevate success in that to the predominant value? I don't understand that. You know, and one of the things that we teach 19-year-old women, which I think is appalling, is that fundamentally your career is going to be the most important thing in your life. It's like, no, it's not. It's not the most important thing in most people's lives. And so, and for good reason. I mean, and part of the reason, if you have a job, the reason people pay you is because you wouldn't choose to do it. That's kind of a hint, you know, in some sense. And so if you're one of those people who is fortunate enough to combine vocation with income, well, good for you, but geez, that's pretty damn rare. It's the odd entrepreneur or creative person who can pull that off, but it's very, very rare. So it's a lie as far as I'm concerned, because most people realize, especially as they get older, that most of what satisfies them, what they find deeply satisfying about life is love, I would say, is they have a good, maybe they have a good marriage. That's certainly something. They have kids, and their kids are really, you know, you have kids, and all of a sudden there are people in the world that are more important than you. That's really something. And so you have your kids, and they get more important to you as you get older, I think. I mean, maybe not, because they're pretty important to begin with, but they certainly seem to, as I've got older, and I've had a stellar career, I would say, in terms of the rewards that it's delivered to me. It's like, I would by no means say that in my scheme of things that it takes priority over my wife and my kids in terms of what's made my life rich and valuable. And so I don't know why we're selling this bill of goods. If you believe that the Western common law tradition or its variants is fundamentally a manifestation of the patriarchal tyranny, then you can also believe that the presumption of innocence is a patriarchal plot. And if you believe that, then you can move to a system that uses preponderance of evidence, and you can move to a system where you automatically believe the accuser. It's like, well, go ahead. If you don't think that the power of accusation can be used in a malevolent fashion, then your eyes aren't very open and you haven't lived very long. And that doesn't mean that I believe that the majority of women who bring allegations of sexual assault are in fact doing that. That's not the point. The point is that it's a hell of a thing for us to have invented the presumption of innocence. It flies in the face of the innate human desire to mob together and burn. But we managed it. And it's something unbelievably precious, and it's something that protects each of us, that presumption of innocence. The Marxists, for example, will take that perspective. They say, well, hierarchies privilege and dispossess, and that's the fault of Western culture and capitalism. It's like, no, that's not true. Now, if you're really concerned about the dispossessed, you're going to take the problem of hierarchies a lot more serious than the Marxists. Especially because we also know that even if you set up a Marxist paradise, and bloody well good luck with that, I'll say, that you're not going to produce a society that has less inequality. You're going to produce a society that in fact has more inequality and less wealth. The one thing you can say about capitalism and the West is that along with the inevitable inequality produced by hierarchies, we've managed to produce a certain modicum of wealth and lifted the bottom end out of absolute dreadful poverty. It isn't dominance that constitutes human hierarchies if they're functioning properly. It's competence. And that's a completely different thing. And competence is multifaceted. The idea that our society, for example, is fundamentally a tyrannical patriarchy, first of all, is the ignorant misuse of what's essentially a symbolic idea. And second, an absolute falsehood. It's not like our hierarchical systems are perfect, and they do tilt towards tyranny and blindness. We have to be awake to prevent that from happening. But fundamentally, in our functional cultures, most people play a straight game, and they play a straight game across long periods of time, and that actually turns out to be a much more stable means of attaining hierarchical position than use of anything as arbitrary as power or tyranny. Even in chimpanzees, the tyrant chimps tend to meet a pretty vicious end, and they're nowhere near as sophisticated socially as human beings. And so, well, so that's what that chapter is about. It's like hierarchies dispossess. The people who are dispossessed need a voice. That's the proper voice of the left. The proper way forward through life is courageous encounter with vulnerability, the ability to stand up and take that on as a burden, and that's the most effective way of manifesting success in the long term in the hierarchical structures that human beings create. So, and I think all of that is, as far as I'm concerned, that's rock solid. First of all, it depends on which element of the hierarchy you look at. And second of all, it's not men, okay? It's a tiny percentage of men, and that's not the same as men. Because most men aren't at the top. In fact, if you look at people who are truly at the bottom, most of them are men. So it's a small proportion of men. And then it's a very arbitrary slice. It's like, okay, so you're saying, well, what are we saying exactly? There's a disproportionate number of white Anglo-Saxon men who are billionaires. Could easily be. What does that have to do with men exactly? Why is that a male thing? It's like, it's not like all these men are like that. They're not like that. It's a tiny proportion of people who are like that, and they do happen to mostly be men. But that doesn't indicate some fundamental inadequacy in the entire social structure. I mean, 99% of bricklayers are men. Is that a problem? Well, nobody ever points it out. Like, all you have to do is go on the U.S. Department of Labor website, and you can look at occupation ranked by gender. There's about 50 occupations that are 95% men and over. You don't ever hear a word about them. Well, why? Because they're dusty, grueling, difficult, trade-related, intensely laborious outside jobs. Well, that's why. So, and why aren't we struggling for equality, gender equality among bricklayers? By force, let's say. From here on in, it's by fiat, man. 50% of women, they want to be nurses. No damn way. It's off to the brickworks with you. The left collectivism is, well, groups are at war, and we need to deprivilege the privileged and reprivilege the underprivileged. And the right wing says, no, we'll just take our privileges and burn the whole place down if you're not careful. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, neither of those approaches are approaches that I believe are, neither of those approaches lead anywhere except to terrible places. And so that's why, to the degree that I've been able to, I've been stressing the responsibility of the individual, because the way that the West determined how to avoid that tension of opposites was to put the individual first and say, it's your responsibility to keep the state in order. And you do that by putting your house in order first. And if enough individuals put their house in order and act in the manner that is required of someone who is genuinely the foundation bedrock of the state, then it won't oscillate so badly that it will collapse. And I think that that's the case. I think that works. And so, as far as I'm concerned, and this is partly why I've been going around the world lecturing, I mean, there's an audience for it. I'm trying to convince people to take on the burden of their responsibility in the face of their suffering, and to become the sort of people who will not be tempted by the blandishments of the radicals on the left or the right. When I was studying collectivist catastrophes, the collectivist catastrophes of the 20th century, both the fascist and the communist catastrophes, one thing that kept standing out to me, and maybe it's because I have a psychological bent, was that these totalitarian states, with their absolute abject murderousness, couldn't have come about if the individuals within those societies hadn't abdicated their fundamental sovereign responsibilities. And the abdication took two forms. One was direct complicitness, right, to actually participate in the totalitarian processes and the atrocities themselves. And the other was turning a blind eye when they knew perfectly well it was no longer time to turn a blind eye. It's the sovereign duty of individual citizens to pay attention and to keep things from deviating too far. And so you do that in part through dialogue with your own conscience. It's like, well, maybe the collectivists are putting a little bit of pressure on you at work. You know, like maybe in the UC system in the United States, for example. Now, if you want to be a professor, you have to formulate and sign a diversity, inclusivity, and equity statement. Well, how about no? Right? If 20 credible people in that system said there's no bloody way I'm formulating that and signing it, it would come to a halt. But, you know, people think, well, it's okay. It's like, no, it's not. It's not even a little bit okay. You just give away a little bit of your soul. The problem with the radical left types is that you can't even talk to them about free speech because they don't believe it exists. It isn't that they think that free speech should be regulated more heavily, it's that they believe the concept itself is flawed. Because A, there are no individuals, there are just identity groups. So if you have an opinion, you don't have an opinion because there isn't any you. You're a mouthpiece for your group identity. And if you happen to be a victimizer group, then all you're using your capacity for speech for is to justify the tyrannical power structure that you happen to occupy as someone who's privileged. And there's no dialogue between you and the victim because dialogue assumes that two individuals of goodwill, and so there's no individuals and there's no goodwill because it's all power, could actually have a conversation and reach some sort of, what would you call, mediated and negotiated conclusion. Well, that doesn't exist within the collectivist framework, that way of looking at the world. So it's not a debate about limits on free speech, it's a debate about the conceptual validity of the idea of free speech itself.